It was upon one of those restless autumn nights, when the wind rattled against the window panes and the rain drummed a ceaseless rhythm upon the rooftops of London, that Sherlock Holmes and I found ourselves in the warmth of our sitting room at 221 B Baker Street. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows against the bookshelves, and the air was thick with the scent of Holmes's tobacco, curling in spectral whirls toward the ceiling. Holmes sat in his customary chair, his long fingers steepled, eyes half-lidded but keen, lost in some private reverie of thought. I had, for my part, abandoned a futile attempt at reading the evening paper, my thoughts as unsettled as the storm outside. There was in Holmes's manner a peculiar tension, as though he anticipated some unseen force upon the threshold of our evening. I was about to remark upon this when a sudden, frantic knocking shattered the stillness. Holmes's eyes snapped open. "We are about to have a visitor, Watson," he murmured, rising in one fluid motion, "and not, I suspect, a bearer of good news." The knocking came again, sharp and insistent. I hurried to the door and flung it open, revealing a figure drenched by the rain, his face pale and drawn in the dim gaslight. Sir Reginald Ashcroft, a man of considerable stature in the Foreign Office, stood upon our doorstep, his breath ragged, his expression one of barely concealed desperation. The moment Sir Reginald Ashcroft stepped inside, he collapsed into the nearest chair, his sodden overcoat trailing water onto the rug. His gloved hands trembled as he removed his hat, revealing hair slicked with moisture and a countenance drawn by some terrible burden. Holmes, ever the master of composure, took his place opposite our guest, his piercing gaze already at work upon the man. "Your distress is evident, Sir Reginald," he remarked, his voice even, "and the hour of your visit suggests a matter of no ordinary consequence." The official exhaled a long, unsteady breath, running a hand through his damp hair. "Mr. Holmes, I have come to you because there is no one else I can trust. The matter I bring concerns the very stability of the empire itself." Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest, but he did not interrupt. "I have been entrusted with documents of the utmost importance," Sir Reginald continued, "papers containing information that, if exposed, could unravel years of diplomatic effort and plunge Britain into chaos. And now—" He swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now they are gone." Watson though I was, accustomed to the grim cases Holmes undertook, even I felt a chill at the weight of his words. Holmes, however, remained impassive, merely reaching for his pipe. "You speak of theft," Holmes said, "and yet I sense there is more to it than simple burglary." Sir Reginald's gaze darted about the room as though fearing unseen listeners. "There was also a note, Holmes," he murmured. "A message left in place of the stolen papers. And I fear—" He hesitated, his voice lowering to a whisper. "I fear it is a warning." Holmes leaned forward, his sharp features illuminated by the glow of the fireplace. "A note, you say?" Sir Reginald reached into the breast pocket of his coat with trembling fingers and produced a folded scrap of paper, which Holmes took delicately. I peered over his shoulder as he unfolded it, revealing a short, cryptic message written in a hand both elegant and unfamiliar. "The shadow moves where the lion sleeps. Beware the dawn." Holmes studied it intently, his brow furrowing. "Fascinating," he murmured, his voice betraying no immediate conclusions. "And the document, when did you last see it?" "Last night," Sir Reginald replied. "I secured it in my study at Whitehall, under lock and key. This morning, the lock was unbroken, the room undisturbed, yet the document was gone." "An impossibility," I muttered. Holmes shot me a brief, knowing glance. "Not an impossibility, Watson, but rather a problem of access and method. Either the thief possesses means beyond the ordinary, or they were never truly an intruder to begin with." Sir Reginald's face darkened. "There is only one possible conclusion," he said. "Someone within the government must have taken it." Holmes nodded absently, his fingers lightly brushing the edge of the note. You assume that the motive is espionage. Sir Reginald hesitated. I can see no other explanation. Holmes said nothing for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with slow precision, he held the note up to the light, scrutinizing every fibre of the paper. This ink, he said at last, is of a peculiar variety. A blend seldom used in England but quite common in the East. Sir Reginald sat bolt upright. Then my worst fears are true. Perhaps, Holmes murmured. Or perhaps this is merely what the thief wishes you to believe. The room fell into silence, save for the steady patter of rain upon the windows. I saw in Holmes's gaze the glint of an intellect already far ahead of us, threading together fragments of a mystery yet unseen. At last, he turned to Sir Reginald with quiet resolve. This is no mere burglary, Sir Reginald. This is a game played by those who rule from the shadows. And if I am to play, I must know every detail you have withheld from me. Sir Reginald's face paled. I have told you all I know. Holmes's sharp gaze cut through the denial like a knife. No, Sir Reginald, he said, his voice dangerously soft. You have told me all that you wish me to know. Now, if you truly desire my assistance, you will tell me everything. Sir Reginald hesitated only a moment longer before his shoulders slumped, and with a weary sigh he began to speak. Holmes turned the note over in his fingers, his keen eyes absorbing every detail. The paper was of fine stock, its edges neatly cut, save for a faint smudge at the corner. The ink, though dark, bore a subtle sheen under the gaslight, uncommon, save for compositions laced with exotic resins. Fascinating, Holmes murmured, holding the note closer. This is not the careless scrawl of a common burglar. This was placed with deliberation, meant to be found. Sir Reginald leaned forward, his breath unsteady. Then you believe it is a warning? Holmes tapped the parchment against his fingertips. A warning? Perhaps. A message. Most certainly. Observe, Watson, the phrasing. The shadow moves where the lion sleeps. Beware the dawn. Does that not strike you as a deliberate metaphor? I read the words again. The lion, surely a reference to Britain. Precisely. And the shadow. His gaze flickered towards Sir Reginald. A force unseen, moving within our very halls of power. Sir Reginald stiffened. But who? That, Sir Reginald, is the question before us. Someone has gone to great lengths to retrieve this document without detection. And yet, they leave behind an ominous clue. No, this is no ordinary act of theft. It is a maneuver in a far greater game. Holmes laid the note upon the table. A game, I suspect, that has already claimed its first move. Holmes shifted in his chair, his gaze sweeping over Sir Reginald with the same meticulous scrutiny he afforded to crime scenes. You are uneasy, Sir Reginald, not merely due to the theft, but something more. I see it in the tremor of your hands, the slight hesitation in your words. Sir Reginald recoiled. I assure you. Holmes raised a hand. Your assurances are of little consequence to the ink upon your fingers. You have handled documents recently, perhaps ones of great sensitivity. Sir Reginald's lips parted, but he hesitated. And the scent, Holmes continued, lingering upon your coat, an Eastern tobacco, unfamiliar to most in London, but unmistakable to those acquainted with foreign embassies. A shadow passed over Sir Reginald's face. Mr. Holmes, I fear I may be in graver danger than I first believed. Holmes inclined his head. Yes, Sir Reginald, I rather think you are. Sir Reginald exhaled slowly, his composure eroding. Then you will assist me, Mr. Holmes. Holmes took a final glance at the cryptic note before placing it carefully upon the table. I shall take the case, Sir Reginald, but I offer you this warning. He leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. Secrets of this magnitude are never stolen without consequence. Those who seek to possess them seldom leave loose ends. Sir Reginald swallowed hard. You believe my life is at risk? Holmes retrieved his pipe, lighting it with deliberate ease. "I believe, Sir Reginald, that you must ask yourself a far graver question, not whether your life is at risk, but whether you were ever meant to survive this affair at all." The morning was grey and sullen as we made our way through the bustling streets of London towards Sir Reginald Ashcroft's estate. The rain of the previous night had left the roads slick, and a heavy mist clung to the air, muting the sounds of the city. Holmes had been unusually silent throughout the journey, his gaze fixed upon some unseen horizon, his mind already grappling with the enigma before us. The Ashcroft residence was a stately manor in Belgravia, a towering monument to wealth and influence. As our cab drew to a halt, I could not help but notice the increased presence of uniformed guards, their expressions grim and watchful. Holmes, ever attuned to his surroundings, observed them with mild interest. "A most curious display," he murmured as we stepped out. "One might assume a plot against the monarchy itself, rather than a mere case of stolen papers." We were led inside by a stoic butler, who guided us through a dimly lit corridor to Sir Reginald's study. The man's demeanour was stiff, his movements precise, yet there was something in his downcast gaze that suggested unease. Holmes, of course, took note. As we entered the study, Sir Reginald rose to greet us, his face lined with weariness. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, his voice heavy with concern. "I trust you will make sense of this madness." Holmes inclined his head. "Madness, Sir Reginald, is simply order yet to be deciphered. Let us begin." The study was immaculate, with its polished oak furniture and towering shelves of leather-bound volumes. A large mahogany desk stood at the centre, the surface disturbingly bare save for a few scattered papers. Holmes moved forward with unhurried precision, his sharp gaze sweeping the room. "You are certain," he said, turning to Sir Reginald, "that this room remained locked throughout the night?" "Absolutely," Sir Reginald affirmed. "I secured the document in this very desk before retiring. This morning, I found the drawer locked as I had left it, yet the paper was gone." Holmes raised an eyebrow. No sign of forced entry, no broken locks, none whatsoever. I examined the desk myself, confirming Sir Reginald's claim. The lock was intact, its mechanism showing no tampering. It was as though the document had simply vanished. "A locked room puzzle," I mused. Holmes nodded. "Indeed, but a trick is only as effective as the magician performing it." He knelt by the desk, fingers brushing against the wood. "A trick leaves traces, Watson. We need only look closely enough." He straightened, his hand resting lightly upon the surface. This theft was not conducted in haste. The culprit had both knowledge of the document's location and confidence in their method of retrieval. Which means, Sir Reginald, that your thief is not an intruder, but someone who belongs within these walls. Sir Reginald paled. "You mean someone inside this house?" Holmes confirmed, his voice like a blade. "Now, let us see what they left behind." Holmes moved about the study with the grace of a man utterly at ease in his element. His eyes flitted over the space, his hands hovering over surfaces as though he could extract the truth from the very air. "The ordinary eye perceives disorder," he murmured. "The trained eye sees design." I watched as he knelt beside the window, his fingers lightly tracing the wooden sill. "Do you notice anything, Watson?" I leaned in, but saw only dust. "Nothing remarkable." Holmes smiled faintly. "Quite so. And yet, here," he pointed to a barely perceptible mark, "a speck of ash. Not from a domestic fire, mind you, but cigar ash. A most particular variety, with a distinctive grey-white hue. Would you care to guess where such tobacco is commonly found?" I frowned. "The East?" Holmes nodded. "Precisely. And we must ask, why should the presence of such a thing be notable in Sir Reginald's private study?" Sir Reginald himself seemed at a loss. "I do not smoke cigars, nor do my servants. Holmes turned sharply. Then we must conclude that someone stood at this window last night, cigar in hand, observing your home. And that same individual, I wager, is tied to the theft of your missing document. He rose and moved to the desk once more, crouching beside it. And here, Watson, observe this scratch upon the floorboards, faint but deliberate. Something heavy was moved, and recently. I saw it now, a subtle but distinct groove in the polished wood. The desk? I asked. Perhaps, Holmes mused. Or something within it. He turned back to Sir Reginald, his expression unreadable. Tell me, was there anything else within this drawer, something you may not have considered relevant? Sir Reginald hesitated. There was a small compartment at the back. I never used it myself, but it was there. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Then, my dear Watson, I believe we have found our stage, but the players remain unseen. We must next examine the cast. Holmes straightened from his examination of the floor and turned to Sir Reginald. We must speak with your household, particularly those who had access to this room last night. Sir Reginald hesitated, but rang for his butler, a tall and spare gentleman with sharp features and an air of quiet efficiency. He introduced himself as Mr. Hollins, having been in Sir Reginald's service for over 20 years. Holmes wasted no time. Mr. Hollins, were you on duty last evening? Yes, sir, Hollins replied. I was the last to retire, having secured the doors and ensured that all was in order for the night. And did you observe anything unusual? The butler hesitated, glancing at Sir Reginald before answering. There was something, sir. Just past midnight, I was extinguishing the lamps in the corridor when I happened to glance out the window. I saw a figure, tall, cloaked, standing just beyond the garden wall, watching the house. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Could you discern any features? No, sir. The mist was thick, and the figure remained in shadow. But I recall something peculiar. When the church bells struck the quarter hour, the figure moved quickly away, disappearing into the night. Holmes nodded. And yet, the document was stolen without disturbance. Curious, is it not, Watson? It suggests the figure was there to observe, not to act, I replied. Precisely. Which means, Holmes murmured, our true culprit may already be within these walls. Holmes turned next to Miss Edith Hargrove, Sir Reginald's personal secretary, a woman of neat attire and composed manner, yet whose fingers twisted nervously in the folds of her dress as she spoke. You were the last to check the documents, I presume? Holmes inquired. Yes, Mr. Holmes, she said, her voice precise. At 6:30 yesterday evening, I placed them in the drawer and locked it myself. And were they undisturbed when you departed? Absolutely, she said firmly. I would swear to it. Holmes regarded her for a moment. Did anyone else enter the study after you? Miss Hargrove hesitated. Only Mrs. Keene, the housemaid. She came to tidy the room before dinner. Holmes gestured for Mrs. Keene, a middle-aged woman with a round face and a nervous demeanour, to step forward. Tell me, what did you observe? Begging your pardon, sir, she said, wringing her hands. But the drawer was ajar when I came in. Holmes raised a brow. Ajar? Yes, sir. Only slightly, but it was enough to notice. Miss Hargrove gasped. That is impossible. I locked it myself. Holmes steepled his fingers. Then either Mrs. Keene is mistaken, or someone tampered with the drawer after you left. Sir Reginald's face darkened, which means the thief had access to the study long before the crime was discovered. Indeed, Holmes mused, and I believe I know where to look for further answers. Holmes stepped back toward the desk, his fingers trailing along its polished surface. Sir Reginald, you mentioned a small compartment within the drawer. May I? Sir Reginald, looking perplexed, nodded. Holmes knelt beside the desk, tracing his hands along its interior. A moment later, his fingers pressed upon a subtle indentation, and with a faint click, a concealed compartment slid open. A small envelope lay within. Holmes withdrew it, turning it over in his hands. This, I believe, was meant to be found later. Would you care to explain, Sir Reginald? Sir Reginald's face paled. I had nearly forgotten. That compartment was used for storing unofficial correspondences. I never placed anything of importance there. Holmes opened the envelope. Inside was a single, folded slip of paper, its contents written in the same elegant hand as the cryptic note left behind. It is too late. The lion stirs, but the shadow has already moved. A heavy silence settled over the room. I could see the unease in Sir Reginald's countenance, the confusion in Miss Hargrove's eyes, and the nervous shifting of Mrs. Keen's hands. Holmes folded the note carefully. Gentlemen, this is no ordinary theft. This is a challenge, and I do believe our adversary expects us to play our part accordingly. Holmes remained by the desk, his fingers idly tapping the polished wood, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. He turned suddenly to Sir Reginald. Tell me, sir, who else had access to this study? Sir Reginald hesitated. Aside from myself and my secretary, only a few trusted associates. But none would dare. Holmes cut him off with a sharp gesture. Names, Sir Reginald. The official's gaze flickered, and a shadow passed over his face. Lord Harrington. I glanced at Holmes, noting the faint narrowing of his eyes. Lord Arthur Harrington, a man of high standing, yet one whose name was often whispered in connection with matters of diplomatic intrigue. His views on Britain's foreign policies were contentious, and rumours swirled of his unofficial dealings with foreign interests. Holmes leaned forward. He had access to this room. Sir Reginald exhaled. Yes, but I cannot believe he would stoop to such treachery. Cannot believe, or will not believe, Holmes mused. Consider, Watson, a document of grave importance vanishes without a trace, yet no signs of forced entry exist. The study's access is limited, and the only individual outside Sir Reginald's trusted staff is a man with alleged foreign ties. Then you suspect Lord Harrington? I asked. Holmes shook his head. Suspect. Number, but I do find it most convenient that a man rumoured to traffic in state secrets is entangled in a case where state secrets have gone missing. Sir Reginald's face darkened. You must tread carefully, Mr. Holmes. Lord Harrington is powerful. Indeed, Holmes murmured, but so too are the shadows in which he walks. Holmes took up the cryptic note once more, holding it to the light. The shadow moves where the lion sleeps, he murmured. What do you make of it, Watson? I considered. A warning, a suggestion that unseen forces are at play. Precisely. This is no simple burglary, no act of common theft. This is a manoeuvre in a far greater game. He turned to Sir Reginald. You are not merely the victim of a crime, Sir Reginald. You are a player in an intrigue that reaches beyond your office, beyond Whitehall itself. The question is not who stole the document, but whose hands now guide its fate. I saw Sir Reginald swallow hard. Holmes folded the note carefully and placed it within his pocket. Come, Watson, we have a visit to make. Holmes was silent during our journey. His long fingers steepled before him, his gaze fixed upon the shifting streets of London. I had seen him in such moods before, his mind turning like the inner mechanisms of some finely wrought instrument, measuring unseen calculations against the world before him. Diogenes Club, he instructed the cab driver as we passed through Pall Mall. A matter of some urgency. I turned to him in surprise. Your brother? Who else, Watson? This matter moves in circles where only Mycroft may glimpse the full design. Within minutes, we stood before the Diogenes Club, that most peculiar of institutions, a place where conversation was discouraged, silence reigned, and men of influence met not for social discourse, but for the quiet observation of empire. A discreet nod to the attendant was all that was required to grant us entry, for Sherlock Holmes was no stranger here. We moved past the reading room, where figures sat in contemplative solitude, and into a private chamber where Mycroft Holmes, larger, broader and infinitely more inscrutable than his younger brother, sat in his customary armchair. He did not rise as we entered, but his small eyes flicked toward us with the faintest glimmer of recognition. "You are late," he remarked, as though he had expected our arrival. Holmes took a seat opposite his brother. "Then you are already aware of the matter." Mycroft exhaled, tapping a finger upon the armrest. "I have been aware of it since the moment it ceased being a matter of national secrecy and became one of public interest. And I can assure you, Sherlock, this is no ordinary theft. This is a crisis." Holmes regarded his brother with keen interest. "You speak as if the document's contents are of exceptional gravity." Mycroft leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "This is beyond mere political scandal. The stolen document was a covert agreement, an accord between Britain and an Eastern power, whose name I need not mention. It is an agreement so delicate, so carefully constructed, that its revelation would do more than shatter a few reputations." "It could destabilize governments," I interjected. Mycroft's eyes flickered toward me, as though weighing how much I ought to know. "Precisely, Doctor. Watson, if this document were to fall into the hands of foreign agents, it would not be war that follows, but something far worse, a shift in alliances, a disintegration of the balance that keeps Britain secure." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. And yet, the thief left a message behind, a cryptic warning, almost an invitation to pursue them. "Because they do not intend to sell the document outright," Mycroft said grimly. "They intend to use it." A silence stretched between the three of us. Even my practiced medical mind, accustomed to dissecting grim possibilities, reeled at the implications. "You suspect a foreign intelligence operation?" Holmes asked. Mycroft hesitated. "It is possible, but unlikely. This was not a crude act of espionage. The manner of the theft, the absence of force, it suggests a far more calculated hand." He exhaled slowly. "Sherlock, I fear the thief is not an agent of a foreign power, but someone within our own ranks." Holmes's fingers drummed lightly against his knee. "Then we are no longer searching for a mere criminal." "No," Mycroft said, his expression grave. "You are searching for a traitor." Holmes sat in silence for a moment, his fingertips pressed together, his gaze fixed upon some unseen point beyond the walls of the Diogenes Club. At last, he exhaled. "This theft was not an act of mere financial desperation," he said. "A common burglar, however skilled, would not risk such a high-profile crime merely for monetary gain. No, Watson, this was an operation of precision, executed with the discipline of a professional intelligence network." I frowned. "You mean to say that the document was stolen not to be sold, but to be used strategically?" "Exactly," Holmes replied. "Consider the nature of the agreement. Covert negotiations between Britain and an Eastern power. Such a document would not fetch its highest value in the black markets of Paris or Vienna, but in the diplomatic halls of our adversaries, where it could be wielded like a dagger against the heart of the empire." Mycroft gave a slight nod of approval. "Then your course of action is clear." Holmes smiled faintly. "Indeed. If we are to uncover the culprit, we must look not for a thief, but for an agent, someone who moves not for personal enrichment, but for the interests of another power." "And you have a suspect in mind?" I asked. Holmes reached into his pocket and retrieved the cryptic note left in Sir Reginald's study. This message was left deliberately. It was not meant to mislead, but to provoke a response. And if my instincts are correct, there is one man in London whose involvement cannot be overlooked. He folded the note carefully and rose to his feet. "Come, Watson, we pay a visit to Lord Harrington." Lord Arthur Harrington had long been a controversial figure in political circles, a man whose sympathies toward foreign governments were whispered about but never proven. As our cab rattled through the mist-laden streets of Mayfair, I could not help but share in Holmes's growing urgency. When we arrived at Harrington's residence, a grand townhouse with heavy drapes drawn across its windows, I expected our arrival to be met with some resistance. Instead, we were greeted not by a butler, but by a detective sergeant of Scotland Yard, his expression grim. "Dr. Watson," he greeted me with familiarity before turning his gaze to Holmes. "You're here about Lord Harrington, I take it." Holmes did not waste time on pleasantries. "You have already been summoned." The sergeant nodded. "We were called an hour ago by his housekeeper. She arrived this morning to find the house in a state of upheaval. His study was ransacked, drawers forced open, papers strewn across the floor. But of Lord Harrington himself, there is no trace." Holmes stepped past him into the hallway. A forced entry. The sergeant hesitated. That's the strange part. No signs of a break-in. The doors were locked from within, no windows forced. Holmes turned to me. "Watson, do you recall Sir Reginald's study? The missing document, yet no tampered locks. And now another room, disturbed yet sealed from within." I nodded slowly. "You believe this is connected?" Holmes crouched by the threshold of the study, his keen eyes scanning the disorder within. "Not merely connected, Watson. This is the next move in the same game, and I fear Lord Harrington may not have left of his own accord." The detective sergeant shifted uneasily. "Then you suspect foul play?" Holmes rose. "Foul play, without a doubt. But the question remains, was Lord Harrington taken, or did he flee?" Holmes stepped over the scattered papers, his keen eyes scanning the disorder with a detached precision. He moved toward the hearth, where the embers had long since faded, leaving behind only cold ash and charred remnants of what had once been written correspondence. He crouched, extending his hand into the soot-streaked grate. Extracting a partially burned fragment of paper, the edges curled and blackened by flame. He held it up to the dim light filtering through the study window. "Watson," he murmured, "do you observe the ink? The manner in which the fire has licked at the page, consuming its center, yet leaving its edges untouched?" I peered over his shoulder. "Yes, but what does it signify?" "That whoever sought to destroy this letter did so in great haste, and, crucially, not thoroughly enough." Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew a small magnifying lens, scrutinizing the visible portions of text. A sequence of numbers remained intact, neatly written in the lower half of the paper. Sir Reginald, who had been watching with growing tension, inhaled sharply. "A cipher?" "Precisely," Holmes said. "And what do we deduce from its presence, Watson?" I hesitated. "That Lord Harrington received a coded message before his disappearance." Holmes smiled faintly. "More than that, my dear fellow. A man who destroys a letter so clumsily does so not out of caution but out of fear, which means Lord Harrington was either forced to destroy this in a moment of crisis, or, more intriguingly, he burned it himself before vanishing." Sir Reginald paled. "Then you suspect he was complicit?" Holmes tucked the letter into his pocket. "I suspect only that Lord Harrington knew precisely what was coming for him." Holmes settled into one of the few upright chairs in the ransacked study, his gaze fixed upon the half-burned letter. "This is a numerical cipher, Watson, an elementary form of encoding information used by those who wish to obscure their communications without the need for elaborate encryption." He retrieved a small notepad and quickly transcribed the remaining sequence of numbers, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Here," he said, tapping the page. "The structure of the sequence suggests coordinates. These numbers are not random, but a reference, most likely a location within London." I leaned in. "A location? But where?" Holmes's fingers drummed against the arm of the chair. "Consider, Watson, if one wished to conduct a discreet transaction, far from the eyes of the law, where would one go?" The answer struck me almost immediately. "Limehouse." Holmes gave an approving nod. "Exactly. The Limehouse docks, where the Thames serves as both highway and escape route, and where men of every station and allegiance converge under the cover of night." Sir Reginald's expression darkened. "You believe the stolen document is changing hands there?" I believe, Holmes replied, rising, that if we do not act swiftly, it already has. He turned to me, his sharp gaze brimming with urgency. Watson, we have no time to lose. We must be at Limehouse before midnight. And with that, Holmes strode from the room, leaving me to follow, knowing all too well that the night ahead would bring us closer to both the truth and the unknown perils that awaited us in the shadows. Holmes and I arrived in Limehouse as the city's gas lamps flickered weakly in the damp, polluted air. It was a district of narrow alleys and treacherous dealings, where the docks bustled with the murmur of low voices, the clinking of cargo, and the occasional burst of drunken laughter. Here, languages of every nation intertwined, and men vanished as easily as the tide. Holmes had exchanged his usual attire for a worn seaman's coat and a cap pulled low over his brow, a transformation so complete that I might have overlooked him had I not known better. As for myself, I followed his lead, my military bearing concealed beneath a rougher guise. "Keep your wits about you, Watson," he murmured as we moved through the winding streets. "This is not a place where English law holds dominion." We made our way to a waterfront tavern, a dimly lit establishment known as the Red Anchor. Holmes had spoken before of an informant here, a man named Jin Lao, who had dealings with many who operated beyond the reach of the Crown. Holmes signalled to the barkeep, who merely nodded toward a shadowed corner. There, a small, wiry man with sharp eyes sat with an untouched drink before him. "You come for whispers," Jin Lao said in a hushed voice, "but whispers have a price." Holmes slipped a coin across the table. "Then let us hope your price is reasonable." Jin Lao hesitated only a moment before muttering, "The men you seek, they trade under the docks tonight, but be warned, those who watch them do not live to tell of it." Holmes's lips curled into a faint smile. "Then it is fortunate that we do not intend merely to watch." Guided by Jin Lao's information, we navigated the labyrinthine alleys until we reached a concealed vantage point overlooking the docks. The waters lapped gently against the moored ships, and a thick fog rolled in from the river, shrouding the night in spectral silence. Holmes pressed a finger to his lips, and we crouched low behind a stack of wooden crates, peering into the gloom. Two cloaked figures emerged from the mist, their steps careful, deliberate. A third man approached, a foreigner by his dress, his posture rigid with expectation. A silent transaction took place. The first figure produced a small sealed envelope, which the foreign agent accepted with a curt nod. "There," I whispered. "The stolen document." Holmes held up a hand. "Patience, Watson." The foreigner slipped the envelope inside his coat and turned to leave. It was then that Holmes stiffened. "We are not alone," he murmured. A fourth figure lurked just beyond our sight, their movement barely perceptible against the fog. The air seemed to tighten with the weight of unseen danger. Holmes exhaled slowly. Something is about to happen. And then, a single gunshot shattered the silence. The sound of the gunshot echoed across the water, followed by a strangled gasp. One of the cloaked figures stumbled forward and collapsed onto the pier, clutching their chest. "Stay down," Holmes hissed, pulling me back behind cover. The foreign agent whirled in alarm, vanishing into the mist even as the assassin's shadow merged with the darkness. Footsteps pounded along the wooden planks. Then, silence. Holmes's expression was unreadable. The killer knew precisely whom to strike. I exhaled. "Then we have lost our best lead." Holmes shook his head. "On the contrary, Watson, we now have a body to examine, and bodies, unlike men, cannot lie." He rose swiftly. "Come, we must reach him before the dock rats do." Holmes and I sprang from our hiding place, dashing across the mist-laden pier toward the fallen man. The shot had been precise, the assassin's aim unerring. Yet as we reached the crumpled figure, there was no sign of the shooter. Holmes whirled, his sharp gaze scanning the shifting shadows. "Gone," he muttered. "Vanished into the fog, as if they had never been." The foreign agent had fled, his footsteps swallowed by the night. Of the assassin, there was no trace, no discarded weapon, no fleeting silhouette against the gaslit haze. Only silence. I knelt beside the victim, already knowing the truth. The man had been felled instantly, the bullet finding its mark with deadly efficiency. Holmes crouched opposite me, his fingers moving deftly over the body. A clean shot to the heart, I observed grimly. Professional, Holmes murmured. This was no act of desperation, Watson. This was an execution. He pressed his hand lightly to the victim's wrist, then, with great care, turned the man's face toward the dim light. Even in death, his features were unmistakable. Lord Harrington, I breathed. Holmes's expression was unreadable. The game has changed, Watson. A light footstep sounded behind us, and we turned to see Scotland Yard's Inspector Gregson emerging from the gloom, flanked by 2 constables. Holmes, Gregson said, his voice wary, I might have known I'd find you at the centre of this mess. Holmes rose smoothly. And I might have known, Gregson, that you would arrive just in time to be too late. Gregson stepped forward, glancing between us and the lifeless form of Lord Harrington. What the devil has happened here? Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached for Harrington's lifeless hand, his keen eyes narrowing as his fingers brushed against something crumpled in the dead man's grip. A final defiance, Watson, he murmured. Even in death, he clings to the truth. He pried the object free and unfolded it carefully. A half-burned letter, its edges blackened, but its message still visible. Holmes straightened, his gaze darkening as he read the surviving lines aloud. The pact is broken. The lion sleeps no more. We move at dawn. Gregson frowned. What does it mean? Holmes tapped the paper lightly. It means that Lord Harrington was not merely a victim of conspiracy, he was entangled in it. Either he sought to betray his allies, or he realized too late that he had been a pawn in a greater scheme. Then he was killed to silence him, I asked. Precisely, Holmes replied. And consider the wording, Watson. We move at dawn. This is no idle threat. It is a warning. Whatever this organization has planned, it is already in motion. Gregson's face hardened. Then we must act quickly. Holmes folded the letter, slipping it into his coat. Indeed, Inspector, for I suspect that by sunrise, the British Empire itself may hang in the balance. Holmes paced the sitting room of 221B Baker Street, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression sharp with calculation. The events at Limehouse had confirmed our worst fears. The stolen document was not merely missing, but in the process of being leveraged against the Crown. The murder of Lord Harrington had silenced one conspirator, but the true architect of this treachery remained in the shadows. Holmes came to an abrupt halt. They believe they have secured the only copy of the document, he murmured. That is their greatest weakness, Watson. I frowned. You mean to make them believe otherwise? Precisely. He reached for the day's edition of the Times, spread it before him, and with deliberate strokes of his pen, he drafted a letter to the editor, one designed to reach exactly the right ears. Sir, in light of recent diplomatic developments, it is imperative to recall that duplicates of all sensitive agreements are secured in hidden locations throughout the Empire. Recent events have only reaffirmed this necessity. Let us not forget that the true weight of a document lies not in the ink upon its page, but in the knowledge of its existence. A concerned statesman. He sealed the letter and handed it to me. Have this delivered at once, Watson. If our adversary is as cautious as I suspect, they will not risk the possibility of a second copy remaining beyond their grasp. You mean to draw them out? Holmes allowed himself a rare smile. We are no longer searching for a thief, Watson. We are baiting a trap. That evening, we took up our position near an unassuming townhouse in Kensington, a location Holmes had deliberately chosen for its credibility. If our deception worked, our adversary would believe a duplicate of the stolen document lay hidden within. Holmes had insisted upon absolute silence, and so we waited in the shadows, concealed within the alcove of an empty carriage house. The street was quiet, save for the occasional clip of hooves against cobblestone, the distant murmur of life beyond our secluded post. Hours passed. Midnight struck. Still, we remained motionless, listening, watching. Then, Holmes tensed beside me. A figure emerged from the darkness, moving with calculated precision. Dressed in a dark overcoat, the intruder paused at the townhouse steps, glancing furtively down the empty street before producing a set of lockpicks. Holmes exhaled slowly. "There you are," he whispered. With a practiced efficiency, the figure worked at the door. Within moments it creaked open and they slipped inside. Holmes turned to me. "Now, Watson, the game is truly afoot." The night stretched long and silent as Holmes and I remained in our concealed position, our breath slow and measured, our patience unwavering. The street beyond lay still, yet the weight of expectation pressed upon us. Then at last, a shadow detached itself from the darkness. The figure moved with deliberate care, pausing at the threshold of the townhouse before glancing swiftly about. Satisfied that the street remained deserted, the intruder produced a key, fitting it deftly into the lock. Holmes's hand closed lightly upon my arm. "Did you see that, Watson?" he whispered. "Not a lockpick, but a key. Proof that our thief was no common criminal but someone with legitimate access." The door creaked open, and the figure slipped inside. Holmes was upon him in an instant, moving with a swiftness that took even me by surprise. There was a sharp gasp, a scuffle of boots against the wooden floor, and then a cry of alarm as Holmes drove the figure backward, pinning him against the wall. The gas lamp from the corridor spilled its light upon the intruder's face, and I started in recognition. "Miss Hargrove!" I exclaimed. Sir Reginald's demure and unassuming secretary, the very woman who had sworn ignorance of the theft, gazed at us with wide, startled eyes, her expression shifting between defiance and dread. Holmes straightened, his grip firm upon her wrist. "A most unwise decision, Miss Hargrove," he murmured. "You should have known that the hunter must always beware the trap." Miss Edith Hargrove let out a shaky breath, her composure slipping. "This is a mistake," she stammered. "I was merely—" "Retrieving a document you believed to be a duplicate," Holmes finished smoothly. "A document you feared could unravel all your carefully laid plans." She paled, but said nothing. "Come now, Miss Hargrove," Holmes continued, his voice light yet edged with steel. "The game is done. We have already traced your steps, from Sir Reginald's study to Lord Harrington's ill-fated demise. You played your part well, I grant you, but the moment you laid hands upon that envelope, you revealed the truth. You are no mere secretary, but the orchestrator of this entire affair." She swallowed hard, her fingers clenching into fists. "You have no proof," she whispered. Holmes sighed. "Proof? Let us review, shall we?" He held up his fingers, ticking off each point. "You alone had knowledge of where Sir Reginald kept his most sensitive documents. You alone knew when he left them unattended. You claimed the drawer was locked when last you saw it, yet the housemaid found it slightly ajar. A mistake, no doubt, in your haste to secure the stolen papers." Miss Hargrove's breath quickened. "And when suspicion fell upon Lord Harrington, you ensured his silence, whether by persuasion or by force. But when your hired assassin proved too effective, you found yourself in an unfortunate predicament. Your scapegoat was dead, and the document had already begun slipping from your control." A tremor passed through her frame. "Now then," Holmes said softly, "shall we continue this discussion at Scotland Yard, or will you confess the truth here and now?" Miss Hargrove lowered her gaze, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I was never meant to succeed. I was merely a tool in a far greater design." Holmes's expression did not change, though I knew him well enough to sense the shift in his thoughts. "A tool," you say, he mused. Then tell me, who was the hand that wielded you? Miss Hargrove swallowed. You already know, she murmured, but you also know you can do nothing. Holmes studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Indeed, he admitted, for even treachery has its hierarchy. Gregson, who had stood silent until now, stepped forward. Who was she working for, Holmes? Holmes exhaled slowly. Someone within the government itself, he said. Someone too powerful to touch, too cautious to be exposed. This plot was never about mere theft. It was a maneuver, a shift in the balance of influence, played at the highest level of the empire. Gregson's face darkened. Then what do we do? Holmes turned back to Miss Hargrove. We do what must be done, he said. We expose what we can, and as for the true culprit... He retrieved his pipe and struck a match, watching as the flame flickered and died. Some games, he murmured, are won not by confrontation, but by waiting for the king to fall of his own accord. As we sat in the dimly lit sitting room of 221B Baker Street, Inspector Gregson leaned forward, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and unease. Miss Hargrove was in custody, yet the deeper conspiracy remained untouched. Holmes, however, seemed entirely at ease. He took a slow draw from his pipe before speaking. It was an elegant deception, Watson, but even the finest illusions leave their traces. I nodded. The ink stains upon Sir Reginald's fingers indicated he had handled the document before its disappearance, Holmes finished. But more importantly, the ink itself was of a peculiar Eastern blend, used exclusively by a select few government officials. That suggested two things. First, that the stolen document had been copied before its removal, and second, that the thief was not an outsider, but someone within Whitehall itself. Gregson frowned. And the tobacco? Holmes smiled faintly. Ah, the rare Eastern tobacco, an unmistakable scent found upon Sir Reginald's coat. It was not his own, of course, but transferred from close contact with someone who smoked it. Who among our suspects indulged in such a luxury? Lord Harrington, I said at once. Precisely. Holmes gestured toward the cryptic letter we had retrieved from Harrington's study. Yet the most damning clue of all was this, the coded message he tried to destroy. Not because it exposed his own treachery, but because it revealed he had discovered the true conspirator before us. Gregson exhaled. Then Harrington wasn't the traitor? Holmes shook his head. No, Inspector. He was the sacrificial pawn. Gregson ran a hand over his face. So, let me get this straight. Harrington was set up. Indeed, Holmes replied. Consider the brilliance of it. Who better to take the fall for such a crime than a man already suspected of foreign sympathies? From the outset, everything was orchestrated to lead us directly to him. I thought back to the carefully placed clues, the planted note, the staged ransacking of his study. But why kill him? I asked. Holmes exhaled slowly, because he was never meant to be more than a scapegoat. He may have been involved at first, Watson, but at some point, he realized he was being used. He had uncovered enough of the truth to make himself a liability, and so, before he could expose the real mastermind, he was silenced. Gregson's face darkened. Miss Hargrove's doing? Unlikely, Holmes said. She was clever, but she was merely an operative, a facilitator, not the architect of the plan. The true orchestrator remains untouched, hidden within the very ranks of power. A heavy silence settled over the room. Gregson shifted uneasily. And what do we do about it? Holmes leaned back, his gaze unreadable. We wait, Inspector. The game is not yet over, and men who weave such tangled webs inevitably ensnare themselves. I studied him carefully. And if they do not, Holmes gave a slow, knowing smile. Then, my dear Watson, we shall simply have to give the web a little shake. The morning following Miss Hargrove's arrest, Holmes and I found ourselves once more within the sombre walls of the Diogenes Club. summoned at the behest of Mycroft Holmes. We were led into a private chamber where Mycroft sat, as ever, in a state of perfect composure, his fingers lightly drumming upon the armrest of his chair. "You have been busy, Sherlock," he remarked without looking up. "And, as usual, you have made yourself rather an inconvenience to certain parties in high places." Holmes smiled faintly. "A habit of mine, I fear." Mycroft exhaled. "Your deception at Kensington was rather effective. The bait was taken, the trap was sprung, and now, thanks to your timely interference, the stolen document has been recovered." I sat forward. "Then it did not leave England?" "No," Mycroft said. "The transaction was intercepted. The document is now back in the hands of those who will ensure it disappears permanently, as if it never existed at all." I turned to Holmes, expecting satisfaction, but I found only the faintest flicker of discontent in his expression. He took a slow breath before saying, "Then the matter is concluded?" "Officially?" "Yes." Mycroft's gaze sharpened. "And unofficially, Sherlock, I suggest you forget the name of the man who orchestrated it all." Holmes gave a short, mirthless chuckle. "A most convenient resolution, Mycroft, yet it leaves a rather bitter taste." His brother did not disagree. "We cannot always choose our victories, Sherlock. Sometimes we must accept the ones we are given." Holmes stood. "Then let us hope, brother, that one day the right man will be given his due." The trial of Miss Edith Hargrove was swift and decisive. She was sentenced for espionage and treason, a fate she met with cold resignation. I watched from the gallery as she was led from the courtroom, her expression unreadable, her fate sealed. As we stepped out into the crisp air of the London streets, I turned to Holmes. "And so, it is done." Holmes's gaze remained distant. "Is it?" he murmured. I frowned. "We have uncovered the theft, retrieved the document, and seen the culprit punished. What more can be done?" Holmes lit his pipe, the smoke curling lazily into the morning air. "Miss Hargrove was but a pawn, Watson. The true architect of this scheme, the one who stood to gain the most, remains untouched, insulated by power and influence." "You speak of—" Holmes shook his head. "Do not say the name, my dear fellow. Some truths are known but cannot be spoken aloud." I let out a slow breath. "Then you believe justice has not been served?" Holmes exhaled a plume of smoke. "Justice, Watson, is an illusion crafted by those who hold the quill, and in this case, the quill was in the hand of our very adversary." We walked on in silence. Though we had untangled the mystery, though we had prevented disaster, I could not shake the weight of Holmes's words. And yet, as we crossed the threshold of 221B Baker Street, he turned to me with a glimmer of something unreadable in his eyes. "The game is never truly over, Watson," he murmured. "It merely waits for the next move." In the days following Miss Hargrove's arrest, I found myself unsettled, my thoughts returning again and again to the events we had witnessed. We had solved the case. Yes. We had unmasked the traitor, foiled the plot, and ensured that the stolen document never reached the wrong hands. And yet, the taste of victory was strangely bitter. Holmes had often spoken of justice as a construct, a fragile thing, easily bent by the hands of those who wield power. But never before had I felt the truth of those words so acutely. The true mastermind, the faceless official who had orchestrated the theft, remained untouchable, his influence ensuring that he would never be exposed. Instead, a lesser player had been sacrificed to appease the law, a pawn taken from the board, while the king remained untouched. I sat before the fire at 221B Baker Street, lost in these thoughts, the weight of it pressing upon me. Had we truly done good? Or had we simply played our part in a game rigged from the very beginning? Holmes, who had been lounging in his chair, watching me with quiet amusement, finally spoke. "You are troubled, Watson." I exhaled, rubbing my temples. "I cannot help but wonder, Holmes, If justice can be manipulated so easily, does it truly exist at all? He studied me for a moment before answering. You ask the wrong question, my dear fellow. It is not a matter of whether justice exists. It is a matter of who defines it. I sighed. And in this case, the definition was written by those in power. Precisely, he murmured, which is why we must always watch carefully those who hold the pen. Holmes tapped the bowl of his pipe against the arm of his chair, shaking out the last embers before setting it aside. Tell me, Watson, what troubles you more? That we did not uncover the true villain, or that we did? I hesitated, caught off guard by the question. I suppose it is the knowledge that we know who is truly responsible, and yet can do nothing about it. Holmes gave a faint smile. And therein lies the great frustration of our age, my dear fellow. The villains in the shadows are not always the most dangerous. It is those who stand in the light, shaping the world with a stroke of the pen, who are beyond our reach. I stared into the fire, his words weighing upon me. Then what was it all for? If the real mastermind escapes judgment, what have we truly achieved? Holmes leaned forward, his sharp gaze fixing upon mine. You do yourself a disservice, Watson. Do not mistake the lack of absolute justice for the absence of victory. We have prevented a war. We have saved lives. And we have ensured that those who sought to manipulate the fate of nations must, at the very least, look over their shoulders in the dark. I let out a slow breath. And that is enough. Holmes smiled faintly. It must be. For now. He reached for his pipe once more, striking a match and watching as the flame flickered to life. And yet, Watson, he murmured, exhaling a plume of smoke. The game is never truly over. The powerful always believe themselves untouchable, but history has a way of correcting such miscalculations. I studied him for a long moment before nodding. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps justice, in its truest form, is simply a matter of patience. And with that, we sat in silence, the case closed, at least for the moment. But as I watched Holmes gaze thoughtfully into the fire, I could not shake the feeling that somewhere, in the halls of power, another plot was already being written. And when the time came, Holmes would be ready. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, the glow of the fire casting flickering shadows across his face. He had fallen into one of his rare contemplative moods, staring into the flames as if the answers to the world's mysteries lay within them. You see, Watson, he said at last, justice is a curious thing. The world imagines it to be a sword, swift and decisive, but in reality, it is more like a game of chess, every move a calculation, every victory merely a shift in position. I exhaled slowly. And yet, in this game, the king remains standing, while only the pawns are sacrificed. Holmes nodded. For now. But power is never permanent, my dear fellow. The most dangerous men in the world are not those who hide in the dark, but those who believe themselves untouchable, and history has a way of proving them wrong. I studied him carefully. Then you believe the true mastermind will one day be caught? Holmes's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. Oh, Watson, no man escapes the consequences of his own design. The question is simply whether those consequences will arrive in time for us to witness them. I let Holmes's words linger in the silence, turning them over in my mind. This case had been one of deception, of shadows moving within shadows, but every grand scheme had its flaw. What do you think, dear listener? What was the conspirators' greatest mistake? Was it their overconfidence? The small but telling clues they overlooked? Or was it the simple fact that they underestimated Sherlock Holmes? Share your theories in the comments below. I would be most interested to hear them. If you enjoyed unraveling this mystery with us, be sure to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes investigations. Share this story with your fellow mystery lovers, and let us continue the pursuit of truth together. Because, as Holmes himself would say, the game is never truly over.